picture this scenario. You're having a perfectly normal day, maybe you're at work, maybe you're at home with family, and then it happens. Someone says something, or does something, and instantly your blood pressure shoots through the roof. Your heart starts racing. Your mind fills with anger, frustration, maybe even rage. And in that moment, you feel completely powerless. Sound familiar? Of course it does, because we've all been there. But here's what's really happening in that moment. You've just handed over complete control of your emotional state to another person. You've essentially given them a remote control to your feelings, and they've just pressed the "make you miserable" button. Now, what if I told you that this doesn't have to be your reality? What if you could develop the ability to stay calm, centered, and completely unshakable, no matter what anyone says or does to you? What if you could become so emotionally resilient that other people's behavior simply bounces off you like rain off an umbrella? This isn't some fantasy or wishful thinking. This is a skill that can be developed, and today we're going to explore the profound insights of Carl Jung, one of the most brilliant minds in the history of psychology, to show you exactly how to achieve this level of emotional mastery. Carl Jung didn't just study the human mind, he revolutionized our understanding of it. And hidden within his teachings are secrets that most people never discover. Secrets that can completely transform how you experience and respond to the world around you. So if you're tired of letting other people control how you feel, if you're ready to take back your emotional power and become truly unshakable, then stay with me. Because by the end of this video, you're going to have a completely new understanding of emotional control, and more importantly, you're going to have practical tools you can use starting today. Let's dive in. Let's start by getting brutally honest about something most of us don't want to admit. We are emotional creatures living in a world that constantly tries to trigger us. And most of the time, we're losing the battle. Think about your typical day. How many times do you find yourself getting irritated by slow drivers? How often do you feel your stress levels spike because of a demanding boss or a difficult coworker? How frequently do you find yourself arguing with family members over things that, in the grand scheme of life, really don't matter that much? If you're like most people, the answer is way too often. But here's the thing that most of us get completely wrong about emotional control. We think that controlling our emotions means suppressing them, pushing them down, pretending they don't exist. We think that being emotionally strong means being emotionally numb. This is not only wrong, it's actually harmful. When you suppress emotions, you don't eliminate them. You just drive them underground where they fester and grow stronger. It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. The harder you push, the more forcefully it's going to explode back to the surface. Carl Jung understood this better than almost anyone. He didn't advocate for emotional suppression. Instead, he taught something far more powerful: emotional integration. Jung believed that true emotional control comes not from fighting your feelings, but from understanding them so deeply that you can choose how to respond to them. It's the difference between being a slave to your emotions and being the master of them. Think of it this way. When you suppress an emotion, you're like someone trying to drive a car while blindfolded. You might avoid a few obstacles through luck, but eventually you're going to crash. But when you acknowledge and understand your emotions, you're like a skilled driver who can see the road clearly and navigate any obstacle that comes your way. This is what Jung meant when he talked about making the unconscious conscious. Most of our emotional reactions happen automatically, without our conscious awareness. Someone cuts us off in traffic and we immediately feel angry. A coworker criticizes our work and we instantly feel defensive. These reactions feel like they just happen to us, like we have no choice in the matter. But Jung taught us that this is an illusion. We always have a choice. The key is developing the awareness to recognize that choice in the moment. And this brings us to one of Jung's most profound insights: the concept of the shadow self. Now we're going to explore what might be the most important concept in all of psychology, and certainly one of Carl Jung's greatest contributions to our understanding of human nature: the shadow self. The shadow is the part of your personality that you've rejected, the traits and characteristics that you don't want to acknowledge about yourself. It's everything you consider unacceptable, embarrassing, or simply too difficult to deal with. And here's the crucial part: it's also the source of most of your emotional triggers. Let me give you a concrete example. Imagine you have a coworker who's always showing off, always trying to be the center of attention. And every time they do this, you feel incredibly irritated. You might think to yourself, I can't stand people who are so arrogant and self-centered. But here's what Jung would tell you. The reason this person irritates you so much isn't because they're arrogant. It's because there's a part of you that wants attention too, a part of you that wants to show off, but you've pushed this part of yourself into the shadow because you've decided it's not acceptable. In other words, we don't get triggered by things that are foreign to us. We get triggered by things that remind us of aspects of ourselves that we've rejected. This is why Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. When someone pushes your buttons, they're not really pushing your buttons at all. They're revealing buttons that were already there, buttons connected to parts of yourself that you've disowned. Think about the people who annoy you the most. What is it about them that gets under your skin? Is it their selfishness? Their laziness? Their need for control? Their tendency to complain? Now, here's the uncomfortable truth. Whatever you dislike most about others is very likely something you dislike about yourself. It might be something you've successfully suppressed or hidden from others, but it's there nonetheless. This is actually incredibly liberating once you understand it, because it means that your emotional triggers are not random events that happen to you. They're information. They're your psyche's way of showing you parts of yourself that need attention and integration. Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. In other words, as long as you remain unaware of your shadow, you'll continue to be controlled by it. You'll keep getting triggered by the same types of people and situations, and you'll keep wondering why you can't seem to find peace. But once you start to recognize and acknowledge your shadow, something amazing happens. Those triggers begin to lose their power over you. When you accept that you have selfish impulses, other people's selfishness stops bothering you as much. When you acknowledge your own need for control, controlling people become less irritating. This doesn't mean you have to act on these shadow impulses. It means you have to stop pretending they don't exist. As Jung put it, I'd rather be whole than good. He understood that accepting our full humanity, including the parts we don't like, is the path to true emotional freedom. The shadow work process involves honestly examining your reactions to others and asking yourself, what is this person showing me about myself? What quality in them am I rejecting in myself? This isn't always easy or comfortable. In fact, it can be quite challenging. But it's also incredibly powerful. Because once you start integrating your shadow, you stop being at the mercy of your triggers. You become emotionally unshakable not because you've eliminated difficult emotions, but because you understand where they come from and can choose how to respond to them. Now that we understand the shadow and its role in our emotional reactions, let's talk about the foundation of all emotional mastery: awareness. Because you cannot change what you're not aware of, and you cannot control what you don't understand. Most people go through life on emotional autopilot. Something happens, they react, and then they wonder why they feel so out of control. It's like being in a car that's driving itself while you're asleep in the passenger seat. But emotional awareness is like waking up and taking the wheel. It's the moment you realize you have a choice in how you respond to life's challenges. Jung emphasized that self-awareness is not just helpful for emotional control, it's absolutely essential. He said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But you can't become who you truly are if you don't know who you currently are. So let's talk about how to develop this awareness practically. The next time you feel a strong emotional reaction, whether it's anger, frustration, jealousy, or fear, try this process. First, pause. Don't act on the emotion immediately. Take a deep breath and create a moment of space between the trigger and your response. This pause is where your power lives. Second, observe. Notice what you're feeling in your body. Is your heart racing? Are your muscles tense? Is your breathing shallow? Emotions aren't just mental experiences, they're physical ones too. The more you can notice the physical sensations of emotions, the more control you'll have over them. Third, investigate. Ask yourself some questions. What exactly triggered this reaction? What story am I telling myself about what just happened? What am I making this situation mean about me, about the other person, or about life in general? Fourth, understand. This is where Jung's insights about the shadow become practical. Ask yourself, what is this emotional reaction teaching me about myself? What part of my shadow is being activated right now? For example, let's say your boss criticizes your work and you feel immediately defensive and angry. Instead of just reacting, you might pause and notice that your heart is racing and your jaw is clenched. Then you might investigate, why am I so upset by this criticism? What story am I telling myself? You might realize that you're telling yourself, my boss thinks I'm incompetent, or I'm not good at my job, or I always mess things up. Then you can understand, this is touching my fear of being seen as inadequate. This is activating my shadow around perfectionism and my need to always be right. This level of awareness transforms everything. Instead of being a victim of your emotions, you become an observer of them. And when you're observing your emotions rather than being consumed by them, you can choose how to respond. Jung taught that emotions are like weather patterns in the mind. They arise, they exist for a while, and then they pass. But most people make the mistake of identifying with their emotions. They don't say, I'm experiencing anger. They say, I am angry. They don't say, I'm having feelings of sadness. They say, I am sad. This might seem like a small distinction, but it's actually enormous. When you identify with your emotions, you become them. When you observe your emotions, you remain yourself while experiencing them. Think of it like watching clouds in the sky. The clouds come and go, but the sky remains unchanged. You are the sky, and your emotions are the clouds. The more you can remember this, the more unshakable you become. But awareness alone isn't enough. It's the first step, but it needs to be followed by action. And that brings us to our next crucial topic, the art of letting go. One of the most destructive things we do to ourselves emotionally is holding onto anger and resentment. We carry grudges like heavy backpacks, and then we wonder why we feel so tired and burdened all the time. Jung understood that holding onto anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You're the one who gets burned. But let's be honest about why letting go is so difficult. When someone hurts us, disappoints us, or treats us unfairly, holding on to anger can feel empowering. It can feel like we're maintaining some sense of justice or control. We think if I let this go, it means what they did was okay. It means I'm weak. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of what forgiveness actually is. Forgiveness isn't about letting the other person off the hook. It's not about saying that what they did was acceptable. It's about releasing yourself from the prison of resentment. Jung said, you are what you do, not what you say you'll do. In other words, your character is defined by your actions, not by your intentions or your grievances. And when you hold on to anger and resentment, you're allowing someone else's behavior to determine your character. Think about it this way, when you hold a grudge against someone, who suffers? The person you're angry at might not even know you're upset. They might not care. They might have completely forgotten about whatever they did to hurt you. But you're carrying that anger with you every day. You're the one losing sleep over it. You're the one whose mood gets ruined every time you think about it. This is what Jung meant when he talked about taking responsibility for your own psychological state. You can't control what others do to you, but you can control what you do with what others do to you. But here's the tricky part, letting go doesn't mean pretending that hurtful things didn't happen. It doesn't mean becoming a doormat or allowing people to walk all over you. True letting go is more sophisticated than that. True letting go involves several steps. First, acknowledge the full reality of what happened. Don't minimize it or make excuses for the other person's behavior. If someone treated you badly, acknowledge that they treated you badly. Second, feel your feelings about it. Don't try to skip over the anger, hurt, or disappointment. These feelings are valid and they need to be experienced, not suppressed. Third, understand your role in the situation. This doesn't mean blaming yourself for other people's bad behavior. It means honestly examining whether there's anything you could have done differently and what you can learn from the experience. Fourth, make a conscious choice to release the resentment. This is where the real power lies. You choose to stop carrying the burden of anger not because the other person deserves it, but because you deserve peace. Fifth, take whatever action is appropriate to protect yourself in the future. Sometimes this means having a difficult conversation. Sometimes it means setting boundaries. Sometimes it means ending a relationship. Letting go doesn't mean being passive. Jung believed that forgiveness is ultimately an act of self-love. When you forgive, you're saying, I value my peace of mind more than I value being right. I value my emotional freedom more than I value punishing someone else. This doesn't happen overnight. For deep hurts, forgiveness is often a process rather than a single event. You might need to choose to forgive the same person for the same thing multiple times as the hurt resurfaces. But each time you make this choice, you're strengthening your emotional resilience. You're proving to yourself that you don't have to be controlled by your past experiences or by other people's behavior. Remember, forgiveness is not about them. It's about you. It's about refusing to let someone else's actions determine your emotional state. It's about taking back your power and choosing peace over resentment. And this brings us to a related but equally important topic: how to transform destructive emotions into constructive energy. Here's something most people don't understand about anger: it's not inherently bad. Anger is energy. It's information. It's your psyche's way of telling you that something important to you has been threatened or violated. The problem isn't anger itself. The problem is what most people do with their anger. They either suppress it, which leads to depression and resentment, or they express it destructively, which damages relationships and often makes situations worse. But Jung taught us a third way: transformation. Instead of suppressing anger or expressing it destructively, you can transform it into something powerful and constructive. Think of anger as raw energy, like electricity. Electricity can burn down a house if it's not properly channeled, but it can also power a city if it's harnessed correctly. The same is true of anger. When anger arises, ask yourself, what is this anger trying to tell me? What boundary has been crossed? What value of mine has been violated? What action does this situation require? Sometimes anger is telling you that you need to stand up for yourself. Sometimes it's telling you that you need to make a change in your life. Sometimes it's telling you that you care deeply about something and you need to take action to protect it. For example, if you're angry about injustice in the world, that anger can be transformed into activism or charitable work. If you're angry about being treated disrespectfully at work, that anger can be transformed into the motivation to have a difficult conversation with your boss or to look for a better job. Jung believed that integrating the shadow includes learning to work with difficult emotions rather than against them. He said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. This includes accepting your anger, your frustration, and your darker impulses, not so you can act them out destructively, but so you can understand them and use their energy constructively. Here's a practical process for transforming anger into strength. First, feel the anger fully. Don't try to talk yourself out of it or minimize it. Anger that's not fully felt tends to leak out in passive-aggressive ways or explode at inappropriate times. Second, identify what the anger is protecting. What value, boundary, or need is being threatened? Anger is almost always a guardian emotion protecting something you care about. Third, separate the emotion from the action. You can feel angry without acting angry. You can acknowledge your rage without expressing it destructively. Fourth, choose a constructive response. What action would actually serve your highest good and the good of others? What response would be most likely to create the outcome you actually want? Fifth, take that action from a place of strength rather than reactivity. When you act from transformed anger rather than raw anger, your actions are more effective and less likely to create additional problems. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the integration of opposites. Instead of seeing anger as something to be eliminated, he saw it as something to be understood and integrated. The goal isn't to become someone who never feels anger. The goal is to become someone who can feel anger without being controlled by it. Think of some of the greatest leaders and change-makers in history. Many of them were driven by a kind of righteous anger about injustice or suffering. But they learned to channel that anger into constructive action rather than destructive reaction. Martin Luther King Jr. was certainly angry about racial injustice, but he transformed that anger into a powerful movement for civil rights. Gandhi was angry about colonialism and oppression, but he transformed that anger into a philosophy of nonviolent resistance. You have the same capacity for transformation. Your anger, your frustration, your indignation about the things that are wrong in your life or in the world, these can all become fuel for positive change if you learn to harness them correctly. This is what it means to become emotionally unshakable. It doesn't mean becoming emotionally numb. It means becoming emotionally intelligent. It means learning to work with your emotions as allies rather than fighting them as enemies. One of the most important skills for emotional resilience is learning to build healthy boundaries. And yet, this is something that many people struggle with tremendously. Jung taught that it's essential to know what belongs to you emotionally and what belongs to others. But in our interconnected world, this can be surprisingly difficult to figure out. Think about it. How often do you find yourself absorbing other people's moods? How often do you feel responsible for making others happy? How often do you take on other people's problems as if they were your own? If you're like most people, probably more often than you'd like to admit. And this is exhausting. It's like trying to carry everyone else's luggage while traveling through life. Emotional boundaries are invisible lines that protect your mental and emotional well-being. They're the limits you set to avoid letting others manipulate or control your feelings. But here's what's important to understand: boundaries aren't walls. They're not about shutting people out or becoming cold and distant. Healthy boundaries are more like a semi-permeable membrane. They allow love, support, and positive energy to flow in and out while filtering out negativity, manipulation, and toxic behavior. Jung emphasized that you cannot be truly helpful to others if you haven't first established a strong sense of self. If you don't know where you end and others begin, you'll constantly be drained by other people's emotional states. Here are some signs that you might need better emotional boundaries. You feel exhausted after spending time with certain people. You find yourself constantly worried about what others think of you. You feel guilty when you say no to requests. You take responsibility for other people's emotions. You find yourself changing your behavior dramatically depending on who you're with. If any of these sound familiar, don't worry. You're not alone, and more importantly, these are skills that can be developed. Here's how to start building healthier emotional boundaries. First, recognize that other people's emotions are not your responsibility. You can be compassionate and supportive without taking on the burden of fixing everyone else's problems. Their feelings are their feelings, not yours. Second, learn to say no without extensive explanations or apologies. No is a complete sentence. You don't need to justify your boundaries to anyone. Third, pay attention to how different people make you feel. Notice which relationships energize you and which ones drain you. This information is invaluable for making decisions about how to spend your time and emotional energy. Fourth, stop trying to control how others perceive you. Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But you can't become who you truly are if you're constantly adjusting yourself to match other people's expectations. Fifth, practice emotional detachment. This doesn't mean becoming cold or uncaring. It means learning to care about people without being controlled by their emotional states. Sixth, trust your intuition. If something feels wrong or uncomfortable, honor that feeling. Your intuition is often picking up on boundary violations before your conscious mind recognizes them. Jung believed that healthy boundaries actually make better relationships possible, not worse ones. When you're clear about what you will and won't accept, others know where they stand with you. This creates a foundation of honesty and respect that shallow relationships lack. But setting boundaries can be scary, especially if you're used to being a people pleaser. You might worry that people will reject you if you stop accommodating their every wish. And honestly, some people might. But Jung would say that these aren't the people you want in your life anyway. The people who truly care about you will respect your boundaries. In fact, they'll often appreciate your honesty and strength. And the people who get angry when you set boundaries? They're showing you exactly why those boundaries were necessary in the first place. Remember, every time you fail to set a boundary, you're teaching people how to treat you. Every time you say yes when you mean no, you're training others to disrespect your limits. Every time you take responsibility for someone else's emotions, you're enabling their emotional immaturity. Building boundaries is an act of self-respect and self-love. It's saying, I value my emotional well-being enough to protect it. And when you do this consistently, something amazing happens. You become much more emotionally stable and resilient. We've covered a lot of ground today, exploring Carl Jung's profound insights into the nature of emotional mastery. Let me bring it all together for you. True emotional resilience doesn't come from suppressing your feelings or pretending that difficult emotions don't exist. It comes from understanding your emotions so deeply that you can choose how to respond to them. It comes from recognizing your shadow self and integrating those rejected parts of your personality instead of projecting them onto others. It comes from building healthy boundaries that protect your emotional well-being while still allowing you to connect authentically with others. It comes from learning to transform destructive emotions like anger into constructive energy that serves your highest good. It comes from developing the awareness to pause between trigger and response, creating space for conscious choice rather than unconscious reaction. Most importantly, it comes from understanding that your emotional state is ultimately your responsibility. Not because you're to blame for what others do to you, but because you're the only one who can choose how to respond to what others do to you. Jung's teachings offer us a roadmap for this journey. He showed us that the path to emotional freedom goes through self-awareness, not around it. He taught us that we must face our shadows in order to step into our light. He demonstrated that true strength comes not from emotional numbness, but from emotional intelligence. This is not easy work. Developing emotional mastery is a lifelong journey, not a destination you reach and then you're done. There will be setbacks. There will be moments when you react instead of respond, when you let others push your buttons, when you forget everything you've learned and fall back into old patterns. That's okay. That's part of being human. The goal isn't perfection, it's progress. The goal isn't to never feel difficult emotions, it's to develop a healthier relationship with those emotions. Every time you pause before reacting, you're building emotional strength. Every time you choose response over reaction, you're becoming more resilient. Every time you set a healthy boundary, you're claiming your emotional power. Every time you forgive someone, not for their sake but for yours, you're freeing yourself from the prison of resentment. Jung believed that the ultimate goal of human development is what he called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, integrating all aspects of your personality, both light and shadow, into a whole and authentic self. When you achieve this level of self-understanding and emotional mastery, you become truly unshakable. Not because nothing bothers you, but because you know how to work with whatever arises. Not because you never feel difficult emotions, but because you know how to transform those emotions into wisdom and strength. The choice is yours. You can continue to live at the mercy of your emotional reactions, letting others control how you feel and what you do. Or you can take responsibility for your inner world and begin the journey toward emotional mastery. Jung's wisdom is available to you. The tools are in your hands. The only question is, will you use them? Remember, as Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But you can't become who you truly are while you're being controlled by unconscious emotional patterns. The journey toward emotional mastery begins with a single step, the decision to take responsibility for your inner world. Everything else flows from there. You have the power to become emotionally unshakable. The question is, are you ready to claim it? If this content has resonated with you and you're ready to take the next step in your journey toward emotional mastery, I want you to do something right now. Take a moment to reflect on one person or situation that consistently triggers strong emotional reactions in you. Using what you've learned today, ask yourself, what is this trigger teaching me about my shadow self? What part of myself am I rejecting that this person or situation is reflecting back to me? Write down your insights. This is the beginning of your shadow work, and it's the first step toward true emotional freedom. If you found value in these insights, please share this video with someone who might benefit from Jung's wisdom. Together, we can create a world where more people understand how to master their emotions instead of being mastered by them. And if you want to continue exploring these concepts, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We'll be diving deeper into Jung's teachings and other psychological insights that can transform your life. Remember, you have more power over your emotional state than you realize. The question is, are you ready to use it?